There are people who move through the world quietly, carrying a softness that no one ever sees. They laugh on cue, smile on instinct, and make light of the things that once cut them open. To others they seem strong, resilient even. But beneath the surface is a familiar strategy, pretending nothing hurts. It isn't dishonesty, it isn't denial. It is survival shaped into performance, a way of keeping the world from touching the places already too tender to bear. And yet, the quietness they wear becomes a language, a shield, a story they learned to tell long before they understood they were telling it. This is the psychology of those who feel safer hiding the ache, those who learned to shrink their pain so no one else would widen it. There is a quiet moment, almost imperceptible, when a person decides to hide what hurts. It rarely begins as a conscious choice. It emerges as a reflex, a soft, internal pulling away. Something tightens in the chest, something retreats in the voice, and before emotion rises to the surface, it tucks itself neatly behind a practiced expression. A smile, a nod, a calm, steady, "It's okay." People who pretend nothing hurts often carry an elegance in the way they hold themselves. Not because the absence of pain makes them graceful, but because concealment has become its own strange art. An art of blending, of smoothing sharp edges, of never allowing the inner world to spill outward in ways that might draw attention. The disguise becomes gentle because they are gentle. It becomes quiet because they have learned to be. To the world, they appear composed, the type who can handle anything, the type who never asks for much. And there is a certain warmth in being perceived this way, a sense of usefulness, of reliability, of being the steady one in a world filled with unpredictable emotion. But beneath that outer calm rests an internal logic shaped by years of subtle self-protection. If no one sees your hurt, no one can misuse it. This isn't dramatic suffering. It's not loud or chaotic. It's the slow, familiar ache of carrying something alone because sharing it feels like crossing a dangerous threshold. Perhaps they once tried, only to be dismissed with a half-hearted, "You're too sensitive," or a quick change of topic. Perhaps their earliest expressions of sadness were overlooked entirely. Or perhaps their pain was seen, but met with reactions that made them regret ever opening the door. And so they learned to swallow disappointment before it forms into words, learned to keep anger contained behind a polite smile, learned that silence is easier than explanation, learned that the safest place to hurt is quietly and internally. Over time, this behavior ceases to feel like a mask and becomes more like a familiar atmosphere, something they breathe in without thinking, something that keeps them stable in moments where revealing themselves feels too exposed, too vulnerable, too unpredictable. The gentle disguise is not meant to deceive others. It is meant to protect the self. It shields them from judgment, from misunderstanding, from the risk of needing support they're afraid won't be given. It allows them to move through each day without triggering old wounds tied to emotional rejection. And so the world applauds their strength, unaware that the applause sometimes aches. There is also a quiet relief in not being asked too many questions, a comfort in predictable conversations that never stray too close to the unspoken. When someone says, "You always seem fine," the heart responds with a subtle mixture of pride and loneliness. Pride, because the appearance of resilience has been maintained. Loneliness, because being misunderstood while being praised creates an ache that is hard to name. But the signs are there if you know where to look. a person who laughs quickly to cover discomfort, a pause before admitting something went wrong, a habit of downplaying everything with phrases like, "It's not a big deal," eyes that brighten just a bit too fast, a body that stiffens the moment a question becomes too personal. The disguise is delicate, not fragile but deliberate, built from years of emotional savings, moments stored, categorized and tucked away. And yet, beneath it all, there is a part of them that wonders what it might feel like to rest, to exhale, to let someone see the sadness they keep hidden behind calm expressions. There is a part that wishes the world could understand pain without requiring a performance. But the fear is stronger. For now. This chapter exists in the space before awareness, the space where a person knows they are hiding something, but hasn't yet questioned why. A place where pretending feels natural, almost effortless, because it gives life the stability they once lived without. This is the beginning of the pattern, a subtle withdrawal, a softened truth, a quiet moment of self-erasure that feels safer than transparency. The gentle disguise becomes a rhythm, and without noticing, it becomes home. The instinct to pretend nothing hurts does not appear suddenly in adulthood. It grows quietly from earlier moments, small, formative experiences that teach a child how safe it is, or isn't, to express what they feel. Often, the lesson is not delivered in dramatic events. Instead, it is whispered through routine interactions, through tone, timing, and reactions that shape a child's internal world long before they understand the meaning of emotional safety. For some, the pattern begins with subtle dismissal, a scraped knee followed by a tired sigh instead of comfort, tears met with impatience, fear met with correction. A child who learns that softness is inconvenient begins to believe their emotions require shrinking. They start with small adjustments, wiping tears faster, speaking less, nodding more. The body takes notes. The brain records that quietness leads to smoother interactions, fewer ripples, fewer misunderstandings. Others grow up in environments filled with louder storms, households where conflict is frequent, unpredictable, or overwhelming. In such spaces, a child quickly learns that adding their own feelings to the chaos only intensifies the noise. So they become small. They become still. They learn to disappear without physically leaving. Every unspoken sentence becomes a skill. Every hidden emotion, a kind of offering to maintain peace. This survival strategy feels noble in the moment, even necessary. But it plants a seed, that their pain must remain unseen for others to remain calm. There are also those raised in cultures or communities where emotional endurance is valued above openness, where resilience is equated with silence and vulnerability is considered a luxury. Phrases like, "You're strong, you can handle it," or "Don't make a fuss," begin to shape how a child views themselves. Recognition becomes tied to composure. Approval becomes tied to self-control. Expressing hurt becomes an act that feels excessive, even shameful. Then there are the children who were subtly praised for being easy. The quiet ones, the ones who didn't cry much, didn't complain, didn't cause problems. Adults marveled at their independence without realizing they were praising a symptom of emotional containment. Over time, these children learn that love comes more reliably when they take up less space, when their needs remain invisible. But not all origins involve family or culture. Some patterns start in early friendships, first heartbreaks, or moments where trust was offered and met with betrayal. When someone young reaches out in vulnerability and is met with ridicule, manipulation, or indifference, the nervous system stores it as evidence. revealing yourself is dangerous. The lesson becomes a private contract with the self. Never again. The pattern forms layer by layer, a moment of being misunderstood, a moment of being told to calm down before anyone asks what's wrong, a moment of being laughed at for crying, a moment where expressing pain made someone else uncomfortable, angry, or withdrawn. Each moment reinforces the idea that emotional invisibility is the safest currency for connection. And so, pretending nothing hurts becomes more than behavior. It becomes identity. The child grows into a teenager who learns to hold heartbreak with a straight face, then becomes an adult who carries disappointment without flinching. People admire their stability, unaware of the foundation beneath it. But inside, the early lessons still echo. They are not erased by time. They are woven into the nervous system, etched into muscle memory, reinforced through repetition. When hurt arises, the body responds before the mind can intervene. The jaw tightens, the voice steadies, the heart pulls back. The early training continues. This chapter is about origins, not to blame the past, but to understand the blueprint. To see that the habit of hiding pain didn't develop out of weakness, but out of adaptation, out of an early need for safety, belonging, or peace. The pattern begins in small moments, but its effects echo for a lifetime. To understand the instinct to pretend nothing hurts, one must look not only at the story of a life, but also at the architecture of the mind. Emotional masking is not simply a choice, it is a psychological pattern woven through attachment, nervous system responses, and cognitive habits shaped by years of reinforcement. At its core, masking is an adaptation. When the brain predicts that showing pain might lead to rejection, conflict, or vulnerability, it activates protective strategies designed to minimize emotional exposure. This begins with the nervous system. When a person senses potential threat, social or emotional, the body shifts subtly into protective mode. Heart rate adjusts, muscles stiffen, facial expressions neutralize. The voice becomes controlled. This is the body's way of avoiding danger, even when the danger is simply the discomfort of being misunderstood. Attachment theory plays a powerful role. Individuals who grew up with inconsistent or emotionally unavailable caregivers often develop a pattern known as avoidant attachment. This does not mean they lack emotion. It means they learned early that expressing emotion did not lead to comfort. The brain adapts by down-regulating emotional expression, teaching the child to rely on self-containment rather than relational support. As adults, this looks like composure, independence, and minimal outward reaction to pain. Inside, however, the emotional world is alive, simply unshared. Another layer involves emotional suppression. This is different from repression. Suppression is conscious, choosing not to show what is felt. Repression is unconscious, burying the feeling entirely. People who pretend nothing hurts often engage in suppression. They feel deeply, but they hold tightly. They monitor themselves. They assess the room. They choose silence, not because they lack emotion, but because expression feels unsafe or unnecessary. The brain rewards this behavior. Every time masking avoids conflict, tension, or discomfort, the nervous system receives positive feedback. A neural pathway forms. Hiding emotion equals safety. Over time, the pathway strengthens until it becomes reflexive. Even when a situation is safe, the body responds as if exposure is risky. Social psychology adds another layer. Humans are highly attuned to group dynamics. Many develop a habit of maintaining harmony by minimizing their own emotional needs. They become the one who steadies the room, the one who absorbs tension rather than creates it. This role provides a sense of identity and belonging, yet it often comes at the cost of internal authenticity. Cognitive patterns reinforce the mask as well. Individuals who hide, hurt, often engage in self-minimizing thoughts. It's not worth bringing up. Other people have it worse. It won't change anything. It's easier this way. These beliefs create a mental framework where emotional expression feels unnecessary, where pain becomes something to manage alone in private moments rather than shared in vulnerable ones. Even the body participates. Emotional suppression is linked to tightened muscles, shallow breathing, and a tendency to freeze rather than process. The body stores what the voice doesn't say. Over time, this can lead to chronic tension or a sense of emotional numbness, not because emotion is absent, but because it has nowhere to go. Yet beneath all this lies something simple: the desire to stay safe. The mind is not an enemy. The mask is not a flaw. It is the brain's best attempt to protect the heart from what it once feared. This chapter does not aim to diagnose or pathologize the pattern. Instead, it reveals the psychological architecture behind it. The mask is not random. It is the product of attachment systems, nervous system responses, learned behavior, and deeply held beliefs. Understanding the science behind emotional masking allows compassion to enter the story. Because beneath every quiet disguise is a brain that learned to protect and a heart that learned to hide. Inside those who pretend nothing hurts exists a quiet contradiction. On one hand, there is a longing to be understood, to be known not only for their steadiness, but for the tenderness beneath it. On the other hand, there is fear. Fear of being misread. Fear of being too much. Fear of losing the connection that the disguise once protected. The conflict is subtle but constant. It shows up in moments when someone asks, "Are you sure you're okay?" And for a brief second, the instinct wavers. There is a flicker, a moment where the truth presses against the throat, wanting to be spoken. But then the old reflex returns, wrapping itself around the words until they dissolve into the familiar response: "I'm fine." To outsiders it seems simple. Just say what you feel. But to someone who has spent years learning that vulnerability leads to discomfort, distance, or judgment, the act of opening up feels like stepping into cold air. There is uncertainty in every direction, a question of whether revealing pain will create closeness or push others away. This internal push and pull becomes a private battlefield. There is the part that wants connection, soft, unguarded, real, and the part that wants safety, controlled, predictable, protected. The desire for closeness exists alongside the fear of exposure. The desire to be seen exists alongside the habit of hiding. The desire for authenticity exists alongside the fear that authenticity will be misunderstood. This tension often shows up in relationships. Those who hide hurt may crave intimacy, but struggle to let others close. They offer presence, but hide their own needs. They give support, but quietly withdraw when they themselves are aching. Their love is deep, but their expression of it is careful. They shape themselves around what they believe others need, rarely asking for anything in return. And yet, even with this restraint, they feel emotion intensely. The heart does not become quieter just because the voice stays silent. In fact, unspoken emotion often becomes louder internally. There is a heaviness that forms in the gap between what is felt and what is expressed, a loneliness that grows not from lack of love, but from lack of transparency. Sometimes they resent their own silence, wishing they could speak without hesitation. Other times, they cling to it, convinced it is the only way to preserve peace. This contradiction can be exhausting. It creates a feeling of being divided, one part reaching out, another part pulling back. Over time, the mask that once felt protective can begin to feel like confinement. The habit of hiding becomes automatic, even when the mind knows the situation is safe. People may offer compassion, and yet the instinct remains. Don't burden them. Don't open the door. Don't risk becoming a version of yourself that someone could reject. And so the inner conflict continues, a quiet tug-of-war between connection and self-protection. Neither side is wrong. Both sides are formed from experience. Both sides hold truth. This chapter explores that tension, not as failure, but as humanity. The internal struggle is evidence of longing and fear intertwined, two forces shaped by past wounds and present hopes. This conflict is not a flaw. It is the sound of a heart trying to find its way back to itself. There comes a moment when the mask begins to feel heavier than the truth. It rarely arrives in a dramatic collapse. More often, it appears quietly, through subtle cracks, small ruptures, tiny shifts that reveal how much the heart has been carrying. Sometimes the breaking point comes through exhaustion, the kind that settles into the body after years of containment. The person wakes one morning and realizes their emotional backpack, once manageable, has grown unbearably heavy. Not because the weight changed, but because they finally stopped numbing themselves to its presence. Other times, the moment is triggered by something unexpectedly small. A simple question asked with genuine softness. A friend noticing the quietness in their voice. A stranger's unexpected kindness. Emotional safety, when encountered unexpectedly, can disarm the defenses that took years to build. The nervous system relaxes just enough for truth to slip through. There are moments when a person is overwhelmed by a feeling they can no longer swallow, grief that leaks through the calm exterior, frustration that trembles in their hands, loneliness that becomes impossible to deny. These emotions do not appear suddenly. They reveal themselves after being compressed for too long. The breaking point may show up as tears at an inconvenient time. Tears that confuse even the person shedding them, or a conversation where the voice cracks without warning, or a moment of silence that feels too heavy to carry alone. For some, the shift begins when someone finally sees them, not their mask, but their effort. The fatigue behind their smile becomes visible. Someone says, "You don't have to pretend with me," and something inside softens. Not because trust is automatic, but because being seen without seeking it feels unexpectedly gentle. But breaking points can also emerge through loss. A friendship ending, a loved one leaving, a plan falling apart. In these moments, the old strategy, pretending nothing hurts, stops working. Pain becomes too large to hide. The body refuses containment. Emotions spill into awareness, not out of weakness, but out of necessity. The moment something breaks is not always painful. Sometimes it is a quiet clarity, a realization that the life built around emotional restraint no longer fits. The awareness that pretending has cost too much, connection, authenticity, self-understanding. This shift does not instantly remove the mask. It simply allows a crack to form, a breath of air, a moment of recognition. Something needs to change, not because the mask is wrong, but because it has fulfilled its purpose. It protected the person through earlier chapters of life. But now, it limits what the heart longs for. This chapter marks the turning point. Not a solution, not a transformation, but a moment where awareness surfaces, where the person sees the gap between who they are and who they pretend to be. And for the first time, they allow themselves to feel the weight of that difference. Breaking doesn't destroy, it reveals, it opens, it makes room for possibility. The moment something breaks is the moment a new chapter begins, even if the person is not yet ready to step into it. After the mask cracks, something subtle begins to unfold. Not all at once, and not in a straight line. Awareness arrives quietly, and with it comes the slow process of reconnecting with the emotions once kept hidden. Learning to feel again is not dramatic. It doesn't look like sudden vulnerability or open confession. It begins with noticing, a tension in the shoulders, a tightness in the voice, a sadness behind the eyes. These small signals, once ignored, start to feel louder. The person begins to recognize when they are shrinking themselves, when they laugh to cover discomfort, when they downplay disappointment. Not because they suddenly know how to express emotion, but because they finally see the ways they suppress it. This awareness is gentle. It is not self-blame. It is not pressure to change. It is simply the beginning of acknowledgement. There are moments when they allow themselves to name a feeling silently. That hurt. I'm disappointed. I needed support. These quiet statements, spoken internally, become acts of self-validation. The emotions do not need to be shared. They only need to be recognized. Feeling again also means allowing emotional complexity, understanding that two truths can exist at once. They can be strong and still hurt, independent and still need comfort, composed and still overwhelmed. Learning to feel does not strip them of the qualities they value. It simply expands their capacity to exist fully. During this stage, the nervous system learns new pathways. Moments of vulnerability do not always lead to danger. Sometimes they lead to understanding. Sometimes they lead to connection. Sometimes they simply pass without consequence. These experiences slowly teach the brain that vulnerability is not synonymous with harm. Feeling again often involves discomfort. Emotions that were once contained may rise with an unfamiliar intensity. But discomfort is not the enemy. It is evidence that something inside is thawing. It is the body remembering how to process rather than store. Another part of this stage is learning to notice safety. The presence of someone who listens without fixing. Someone who doesn't rush them. Someone who sees the hesitation and offers patience instead of pressure. Emotional safety allows the heart to stretch, to test its limits, to move closer to openness without fear. This chapter is not about expression. It is about permission. Permission to feel what arises. Permission to slow down. Permission to be tender within oneself. For many, this is the most transformative part of the journey, realizing that internal acceptance matters more than external reaction. Learning to feel again does not mean abandoning the mask entirely. It means no longer needing it as often, no longer clinging to it as the only form of protection. The mask becomes one option rather than the default. And that shift, though subtle, is profound. The process is slow, non-linear, and deeply human. It is less about changing behavior and more about expanding awareness. Less about performance and more about presence. This stage is where the person begins to trust themselves again. Trust that their emotions have value. Trust that their pain is valid. Trust that they can feel without falling apart. Feeling again is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of coming home to oneself. As the journey unfolds, something gentle begins to settle within the person. Not a sudden transformation, not a dramatic revelation, but a quiet shift, a softened understanding of what it means to be human. hurt, to heal, to carry emotion without shame, and to coexist with both strength and fragility. The soft art of being human is the realization that no one moves through life unscathed. Everyone hides something. Everyone protects something. Everyone carries memories that shaped how they show their pain or silence it. In this awareness, the person begins to see themselves with more compassion. The mask they wore was never a failure. It was a story of adaptation, of survival, of trying to make sense of a world that once felt too sharp. The raw tenderness that emerges in this stage is not directed outward first, but inward. It shows up in the way they speak to themselves, in the moments when they acknowledge their own hurt without apologizing for it, in the way they allow tears without labeling them as weakness, in the way they permit themselves to need support without believing it makes them a burden. The soft art of being human is not about abandoning composure. It is about expanding the emotional vocabulary beyond silence, allowing authenticity to coexist with boundaries, allowing vulnerability to coexist with strength, allowing emotion to coexist with calm. There is a growing understanding that connection is not earned by being unbreakable. It is deepened by being real. The people who matter do not require constant strength. They require presence, honesty, and the courage to be slightly imperfect. But the soft art of being human also acknowledges that openness doesn't need to be constant. It honors the complexity of healing. Some days the mask will return, not out of fear, but out of habit. That is okay. The goal is not to erase the mask, but to loosen its grip, to let the heart decide, moment by moment, how much to reveal. In this stage, the person recognizes that being human means being in motion, growing, retreating, opening, closing, learning, unlearning. There is no perfect version of emotional expression. There is only authenticity, whatever that looks like in any given moment. What changes most in this chapter is the relationship with pain. Instead of hiding it, they hold it gently. Instead of shrinking from it, they lean toward understanding. Pain becomes less of an adversary and more of a messenger. It reveals where they still long, where they still fear, where they still hope. Being human also means allowing others to be human. The person begins to see that everyone wears a mask of some kind. This perspective softens interactions. There is more patience, more compassion, more willingness to see beyond surfaces. Pain becomes a universal language, one that unites more than it divides. The soft art of being human is not a finish line. It is a practice, a subtle, continuous choosing honesty over perfection, choosing tenderness over suppression, choosing presence over disappearance. It is the realization that being human was never about avoiding hurt. It was about carrying it with grace, allowing it to shape, but not harden the heart, allowing it to connect rather than isolate, allowing it to deepen understanding rather than diminish worth. In the end, the person who once felt safer, pretending nothing hurts, learns that the heart is not fragile. It is resilient. It can stretch, it can break, it can heal, it can hold contradiction. And through all of it, it remains beautifully, unmistakably human. This is the quiet truth at the end of the journey. The gentlest freedom comes not from hiding pain, but from allowing oneself to feel it, softly, honestly, and without fear.